Okay, good day, and this is a quick video to introduce you to how to get started on your own My Carbon Zero journey. It's particularly oriented towards individuals. I'll just touch on what you do as a business when we get to the end, but this is for you as an individual to start your My Carbon Zero journey. So, the key thing about My Carbon Zero to get started is to work out your carbon balance sheet. What have your emissions been all of your life, for the entirety of your life, no matter how old you are? So we're going to just do a case here in this video for an average 30-year-old person. Okay, so you've been on the planet for 30 years and you've been responsible for some carbon emissions. Now, on the My Carbon Zero website, that's mycarbonzero.community, you'll see on the individuals page, we have a map, and you can work out, based on where you've lived all of your life, how much, on average, you carbon you've emitted. Okay, so if you go to that map on the individuals page, mycarbonzero.community, you'll find that if you lived in Switzerland, you can hover over the map and it'll tell you how many carbon emissions on average per capita are emitted by each person in that country in that year. So for example, if you've lived in Australia all of your life, for 30 years since you were born, you've lived in Australia, the average carbon emissions for an Australian is 17 tonnes of carbon per year. 17 tonnes of carbon per year. In Switzerland, it's only 4.3. Now people might say, well, why is that? Well, the key reason is the way energy is generated, the way we get electricity. In Australia, it's very focused on coal. In Switzerland, they are focused more on things like hydroelectricity. I believe they still have nuclear plants, or they get nuclear power from outside of Switzerland in France as well. And as a consequence, their overall carbon emissions are lower. Now, if you look at Qatar, which we've thrown in there as a bit of an outlier, it's 38 tonnes, and that's because they live in the desert and they use oil and gas predominantly. And so, yes, they have quite a high footprint. So I'm not going to do this all in my head. I've written down some numbers here. So let's say you're a 30-year-old Australian and you're trying to work out what your carbon emissions have been for that 30 years. So if you're living in Australia, it's 30 times 17, which is 510. 510 tonnes of carbon you've been responsible for emitting in the 30 years of your life. If it's in Switzerland, it's 129, so quite a big drop, and that's because of the difference here. If you're in Qatar, 1,140 tonnes over your lifetime. So you can see, depending on where you live, it makes a big impact. Okay. Now this is quite interesting. Just as an aside, one of the concerns for migration related to climate change is people coming out of low carbon intense countries moving into places like Europe where they have more carbon. But anyway, that's an aside. But where you live does have a big impact, as you can see by those numbers. Now, if we're going to think to ourselves, right, I want to start my own My Carbon Zero journey. If you're in Australia, you'd have to start thinking about things like your R1 emissions, where you're going to try and reduce that 17 tonnes down to a lower number, so that each year you don't add 17 tonnes, maybe you add 10, maybe you can add a lower number based on lifestyle changes. Okay, same here in Switzerland, and those lifestyle changes, maybe you change your diet, you travel less. Okay, these are the things that we talk about in the My Carbon Zero community. But let's say that's what you've got to do, and we're looking at around 30 Swiss francs or $30, 30 euros, it's around the same, per tonne of carbon that you need to invest to take that carbon out of the atmosphere. Okay, so if I'm in Australia and I've got 510 tonnes to take out, so let's just put it down here, Australia, that's around an investment of $15,300 to take 510 tonnes out of the atmosphere. Okay, if I'm in Switzerland, that's an investment at $30 a tonne, 30 Swiss francs a tonne, of only 3,870, and that's for my 129 tonne. If I'm in Qatar, well, it's a lot more, okay? It's $34,200 for my 1,140 tonnes, okay? So again, you can see the impact of where you live. Now, I've just done a blended opportunity because we all move around. What if you lived 15 years of your life in Australia, in Oz as we call it, and 15 years of your life in Switzerland? So 15 years at 17 means 255. 15 years at 4.3 means 64.5. So your total emissions would be 319.5, and your total bill would be 9585. Okay, here's the numbers here. So live all your life in Australia, around $15,000. Live all your life in Switzerland, coming up to $4,000. Living all your life in Qatar, $35,000. Okay. Now we're all sitting there thinking, golly, that's a lot of money. Okay, especially if you're living in Qatar. But the key point about My Carbon Zero that we're trying to make to people is that we need to get that carbon out of the atmosphere. This is for your R3 investments. Okay, to take that carbon out of the atmosphere, to remove that 510 tons from the atmosphere, to remove the 129 tons or the 1,140 tons, because we need to take it out of the atmosphere. Leaving it up there is causing climate change today. And it's getting worse because we add new emissions every year. But the point we're trying to say here is you don't have to invest that today or even this year. You just need to get started. So for example, in my case, my overall lifetime emissions, because I've lived in Switzerland, I've lived in Vietnam, I've lived in the UK, which are reasonably low carbon emitting countries, plus all the years that I spent in Australia, my overall carbon footprint is around 700 tons. Oh, sorry, not dollars, 700 tons of carbon. So I've already invested in a couple of projects to take 36 tons out of the atmosphere and put it in the ground with husk, and another 80 tons with tree planting projects. So I've already taken 116 tons out of the atmosphere, and I've been doing that for 3 or 4 years. It takes time. I've invested about $3,400, $3,500 to do that. And the fact of the matter is that most of us in these developed countries, we spend $1,000 on things that we don't really need every year, at least, right? Maybe in some of us, a month, we spend money like $1,500 that instead of spending it on things we don't really need, we could actually put it into projects to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. That's the essence of the My Carbon Zero journey. It's tough. People say, oh, that's a lot of money, but spread over 10-year time horizon, it doesn't add up too much. And it's fine to take that long. The sooner we can get the carbon out of the atmosphere, the better. But if you haven't got the money to do it this year, to make a contribution this year, do it next year, step by step. If we all did it, if we all took that carbon out of the atmosphere, we'd have a greater chance of at least minimizing or mitigating some of the impacts of climate change and helping the world adapt as it comes. So that's the essence of the My Carbon Zero journey, and that's the story about how we get started. Now, the only last thing to say is if you're a business, working out your lifetime footprint is a bit more complex because it's not just, every business has a different footprint depending on what it does. But there's ways of doing that too, and we can talk about that in another video. Thanks very much.